Welcome into 11 Investigates Case Files. It's an investigative podcast where we take a deeper dive through the stories we spend days, weeks, months, and even years digging into. I'm lead investigator Brian Duggar.
And I'm investigative anchor Melissa Andrews. And today we're heading back into the archives. It's a case that shocked our community and captured national headlines. A nun murdered on Holy Saturday, a respected priest on trial, and justice decades in the making. WTOL 11 traces the path of the Father Gerald Robinson case from crime to conviction.
The story started on April 5th, 1980. Toledo is shaken when Sister Margaret Ann Paul is found stabbed and strangled in the sacristy of Mercy Hospital's chapel. The attack on the day before Easter.
And he kills her, and he stabs her 31 times.
Father Gerald Robinson was a priest at the hospital. Just days after the murder, he presided over the funeral mass. But behind the scenes, suspicion was growing.
So here was the diocese knowing that there was a murder investigation going on, and when asked to produce their records on this priest who was the suspect, they didn't cooperate.
Police questioned Robinson. He took 2 polygraph tests, but wasn't charged at the time. The case went cold.
He said, "Young man, don't ever question God's will for us. I'm here for a reason. It's just that we don't know it." And see, those are not the words of a murderer.
23 years go by until 2003. That's when the Toledo Catholic Diocese gets a letter. In it, an accusation Father Robinson abused a child decades earlier. That allegation leads police to take another look at the nun's murder, and the cold case unit reopens the investigation.
Mr. Robinson, can you hear me?
Yes.
It would be another year, April 2004, until police arrested Robinson. 24 years after Sister Margaret Ann's murder, a suspect is charged.
Well, there's only one person who was unaccounted for during that period of time, who owned a letter opener that fit in the mandible of Sister, and that matched the blood stains, and that was seen in that area, who denied that he was there.
Robinson pleads not guilty. Prosecutors argue he was angry about her complaints against him, so he killed the nun in a ritualistic attack. The evidence? Wounds shaped like an inverted cross.
You would have to have the coincidence of someone stabbing in a frenzy to produce that perfect fit.
It would be May 2006 when a jury found Father Robinson guilty of murder. The judge sentences him to 15 years to life in prison.
My goal is to get him out of prison. And if that happens for early release, then that would have accomplished the goal.
Robinson appeals the conviction multiple times, and each time that appeal is denied, including once by the Ohio Supreme Court in 2008.
He views his incarceration as God's will for one reason or another. He doesn't try to understand it.
Then, in May 2014, the former priest suffers a heart attack in prison. Weeks later, on July 4th, he died while serving his sentence.
Now, that's just the bare bones of the story. So many twists and turns, the use of blood splatter analysis and blood patterns on the altar cloth, the letter opener as the murder weapon, allegations of the occult, sexual abuse of not only Sister Margaret Ann Paul, but of children in ritualistic ceremonies.
And one of the young men you saw in that story was actually David Yonke, who joins us today. Nobody covered this case better than Dave, and I actually worked with him at the Blade. I started the Blade in 1998, and he started there in 1981, and we worked together for more than 10 years. So Dave, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I was a full-time journalist for over 40 years, and I've never run across a case like this. It's unique and it's fascinating. It's sad, but it's a very compelling story.
Mm-hmm.
And you started, like I said, at the Blade in 1981, and this killing took place in 1980, and then he actually wasn't even arrested till 2004. So how did you even find out about this whole thing?
Well, I was the religion editor of the Blade at the time, and But religion editors don't usually cover murder stories. So the police reporter came over to me and in my cubicle and said, do you know Father Gerald Robinson? And I said, well, a little bit. And why? And she goes, well, I think he's going to be arrested. And I said, arrested for what? And it was Chris Hall, and she goes, for murder. And I was like, what? A priest being arrested for murder? So that afternoon he was arrested, and that's when I became aware of it.
I mean, it wasn't just a murder. I mean, he was arrested for killing a nun. I mean, that's even crazier. But yeah, let's get into the case a little bit. And so let's talk about the crime scene. So let's just start there.
Okay, the nun was killed in a sacristy of Mercy Hospital, which is a side room to the chapel, and it's where all the priest's garments and the Holy Communion hosts and the wine, all that is kept, the chalice. And so she was preparing for a Holy Saturday service, and when another nun opened the door, hours later, she found Sister Margaret Ann lying there on the floor with blood around her, obviously dead. And it was a fairly small room. There was the Paschal candle, which is the Easter candle, which represents Christ, was like at her, at one corner of the room. There was also an altar cloth that was over her body. And she had been, after she was killed, the killer lifted her skirt up above her waist, and it was just a horrible scene. And the nun that walked in there just screamed and was hysterical, and then everybody came rushing to the room.
And sexually violated her with a crucifix, I understand.
Yes.
Elements of this suggested some sort of a satanic ritual. Not only that, but also in the things that were done, and maybe you know more about this as a religion editor, but the things that were done were really shown to disrespect Sister Margaret Ann in front of God.
Yes. During the trial, the prosecutors brought in an exorcist from Chicago, a Catholic priest, and he went over some of the signs that this was not just a murder, but a ritualistic murder. And one of them was that the nun had been stabbed in the chest in the perfect shape of an upside-down cross. They found 9 stab wounds, and he said it was as if a cross was used as a template, and the killer stabbed around that. So, an upside-down cross obviously is a satanic or a black mass symbol. Another factor was that the communion host, the Holy Eucharist, was in the sacristy of the chapel that day. For 364 days a year, that Holy Eucharist is kept in the chapel, but for one day, they take it and put it in the sacristy because that represents Christ's death. So they take it out of the chapel, put it in the sacristy, and the murder was, committed right in front of that Holy Eucharist.
Well, in this case went cold for I guess more than 2 decades, but then it kind of got heated up again in 2003 when a woman came forward and she was kind of talking about these ritualistic type stuff, right? So talk about that.
Right. Well, in the original investigation in 1980, they didn't look into any ritualistic aspects of the case, but when it was reopened by the cold case squad at the Lucas County Coroner's Office, Lucas County Police.
Prosecutor's office.
Prosecutor's office, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, when they reopened it, they brought in some new detectives that hadn't been involved in 1980. And this detective, Terry Cousineau, is kind of a visual guy. He does sketches of suspects. And he looked at the altar cloth that had been found, originally was found in the hallway of the hospital, but which had been placed over the nun. And he opened it up and he saw there were 18 marks, and when he folded it back together, he saw that it was the form of a cross. And so he was the one that initially saw that there was some indication that there was a ritual killing. Also, excuse me, in 2003, 2000.
The
yeah.
woman came forward.
Yeah, she was actually a nun in a religious order based in Toledo, and she came forward to the diocese because she said that she had been abused by a cult when she was a child, and that in the cult there were two priests. One was Chet Warren, who was an oblate of St. Francis, and the other was Father Robinson. So when she told the review board that these priests had abused her, and she said also that they had killed children, infants, and she was hoping that the Catholic diocese would pay part of her medical bills, her counseling, and her medicines, because her religious order was covering all the costs, and she didn't think that was right because she felt the diocese was partially responsible and should pay a share. So she was asking for $50,000 to cover her medical and counseling and prescription costs. Excuse me.
I want to go back, though, before we get into that. I mean, first of all, was Father Robinson ever investigated or mentioned during the initial investigation back after she was killed? And also, it seems that there was an allegation that some of the detectives themselves were Catholic, and so they avoided pursuing him and actively perhaps interfered with the investigation. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. The deputy police chief, Ray Vedder, was a devout Catholic, and he was overseeing the whole investigation. He ordered all the reports to be sent to his office. Normally, they were filled out in triplicate and then sent to different police officers, but he wanted all 3 copies, and he put them away in a file cabinet. The police said that in 1980, the Catholic Church could not be touched. They could not arrest a priest. And there's a lot of evidence, and I've got several examples of that in my book about this case, that the police they went to arrest a priest for various causes, molesting children, things like that. And the higher-ups in the police department said they would never arrest a priest. They would take him to the bishop and ask the bishop to handle it. So next thing you know, the priest would be sent out of town or sent for counseling. But even though they had strong evidence that priests had been, molesting boys or whatever, they never arrested them.
So really, the Father Robinson was getting away with murder at that time because there was just such a way of protecting priests in general.
Right, that was the standard policy. The police department was under orders not to arrest the priests. The diocese just had a lot of influence. This is a lot different in 1980. It was before the clerical sexual abuse scandal hit, and people started looking at priests as if they were, could be human, they could be, committing a crime. But in 1980, they were above the law, basically.
It was interesting, you mentioned in 2003 when this woman comes forward, she wants $50,000 for counseling. And the church could have paid that at that point, and this all goes away, right? But when they didn't do that, she ended up taking it elsewhere, right? And that's how this all kind of happened.
Exactly. There was a diocesan review board formed after the 2001 scandals erupted, and they had them across the country. And their purpose was to hear these cases out and decide whether they had merit. And if they did, they would pursue it further. And if they didn't, they'd throw it out. Well, when the nun left the review board, they all said they were going to just throw it. They didn't think it was credible. They weren't going to pursue it. They weren't going to forward it to the bishop. But there was one person on the review board who was a psychologist and actually was not a Catholic. And he said, I think we need to report this because the victim says that they were, they had killed children, and there's no statute of limitations on murder. And as a psychologist, I have a responsibility to report this to the authorities. Well, when he left, by the time he got to his office, there was already faxes threatening him for he could lose his license for violating the privacy of the victim and things like that. But he went ahead and met with a member of SNAP, the Survivors Network of those abused by priests, and they went to the Ohio Attorney General's office and brought the nuns' testimony, written testimony about being abused. And from there, the Ohio Attorney General's office sent the case to the Lucas County Prosecutor's office and said, I'd like you to look into this. So that's how it all got restarted.
And then when the cold case detectives open up this file, I mean, there was a key piece of evidence they looked at, and they're like, whoa,
Yeah.
this might be something here.
Right, that was the letter opener, which I believe was proved in court to be the murder weapon. It was shaped like a saber or a sword, and it had a unique blade. It wasn't just a flat blade like most letter openers. This one had four-sided, kind of like a diamond shape if you looked at it head on. And the detectives that reopened the case saw that the puncture wounds in the altar cloth and in the nun's body matched the shape of that letter opener, which was found in 1980 in Father Robinson's apartment at Mercy Hospital.
Wow.
And they never had any DNA, though, on that letter opener, right?
Right. You know, in 1980, the detectives did not really use DNA. It wasn't a big factor like it is now. But yeah, so when they took it to the lab for testing, it had been, as one detective said, it was sumptuously clean. It was like as if nobody had ever even touched it. But they did a further test, and they popped off a little medallion of the Capitol that was on the handle, and they used a chemical to test for any traces of blood, and it lit up briefly, showing that there was some evidence, but it wasn't enough to be conclusive. But it still led them to look at the letter opener as a possible murder weapon.
This is such a fascinating case, and I'm just shocked there hasn't been a movie made about it yet, but there have been books, and yeah, Dave wrote a book, and you know, years ago, probably be a good time, you know, Jerry Anderson did a story with Dave kind of talking about him back in the day, and so maybe we could watch that package.
Yep.
Dave Yonke is a reporter and now an author. He wasn't in Toledo that Holy Weekend of 1980 when Sister Margaret Ann Paul's bloody body turned up in the Mercy Hospital sacristy. But many were still talking about it 1 year later when Dave came to Toledo to work for the Blade, and he'd hear tidbits over the next nearly quarter century. Then in 2004, an arrest, a priest, and Yonke's talking with police.
And then when they said, you know, there was a ritual involved, well, that really piqued my interest, and everybody. I started getting emails and phone calls from people around the country and around the world.
And with those calls, offers for Yonke to write a book about the case and the trial. And he has. It's called Sin, Shame, and Secret, subtitled The Murder of a Nun, the Conviction of a Priest, and Cover-Up in the Catholic Church. David Yonke poured through thousands of documents and details about the case against Father Gerald Robinson, and his book tells readers things you couldn't know even if you sat through the trial, how prosecutors talked at length with experts on satanic and cult activity.
I got some of their reports that they produced and gave to the prosecution, but they decided not to use it in the trial because it was just too weird, and they didn't want to lose the jury on something like that.
But it's in the book.
It's in the book, though.
Dave Yonke's book also explores questions many of us asked. Why hadn't Robinson ditched his letter opener, the alleged murder weapon? Yonke offers up an explanation from an expert on the occult and satanic killings.
The killers always hang on to the knife because that's where the power is. They believe that there's an energy and a power that's transferred to that knife.
As to what actually happened and why in that sacristy on that Holy Saturday, Yonke says only two people know, and one is now dead. The other, Father Robinson, refusing to talk. And as to the cover-up in the Catholic Church, Yonke points to early involvement in getting Robinson out of a post-murder interrogation in 1980, and much more recently, to the Toledo Diocese withholding information from its own probe until being subpoenaed.
So here was the diocese knowing that there was a murder investigation going on, and when asked to produce their records on this priest who was the suspect, they didn't cooperate.
Uncertain of Robinson's guilt or innocence throughout the trial, Yonke says his mind wasn't made up until the final arguments, and he ended up agreeing with the jurors.
Guilty, yeah. I was convinced.
With this week's Journal, I'm Jerry Anderson.
So there are a couple, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in that story there, but the thing that really intrigues me is that there's a lot of stuff that the prosecutors were thinking about using in this trial, and they didn't because they just thought it was too crazy. So talk about these experts they brought in and why they didn't use them.
Well, they consulted Dawn Perlmutter, who's an expert in the occult, and she's the one that said, whenever there's a ritual killing, it's never somebody's being shot or hanged. It's always somebody being stabbed, and that's why she mentioned that the murder weapon, the knife, is something of power, and they hold on to that. If Robinson had thrown that knife into the Maumee River, he would never have been found guilty. But the other person they brought in, and he actually testified, was Father Jeffrey Grob from Chicago, who at the time was an assistant exorcist for the diocese, and now he is the exorcist for the Catholic Diocese of Chicago. And he testified about all these different symbols that represented a ritual killing, and they had him testify, but then the prosecutor's office backed off that angle and told me later after the trial that they thought it might be too much. Say there was one juror out of 12 that said, I can't believe that priest killed a nun in a ritual killing. So they thought it was, it was very difficult for some people to accept that that's the reality of it.
I'm finding it difficult to, I didn't know that the Catholic Church had like a sanctioned or approved exorcist position.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
I thought that was just made up from movies. I did not, you're blowing my mind on that right now. Wow.
Yeah, I don't think the Toledo Diocese has one, but the bigger dioceses have.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's crazy. But go back to the trial, because you were there every single day when this was going on, and again, you've got a well-known priest from the Toledo community sitting there on trial. I mean, what are your recollections?
And he's wearing his priest, I don't know what the official word is, uniform,
garb,
to show, hey, you're putting a priest on trial for murder. To me, that's a deliberate decision rather than sit in a suit every day. You're saying, hey, remember, I'm a priest.
Yes. That was a big decision, whether he would be able to wear his clerical collar in court, and they said yes, he could. I remember during the jury selection, during the questioning the potential jurors, one man said, I don't care what the evidence is. I don't believe a priest would ever murder anybody, so I would never find him guilty. So he was dismissed. But there was that kind of feeling, that this respect for priests, that they were on a pedestal and they would never do anything wrong, let alone murder somebody. So.
But in the end, the 3-week trial it came down to what, 6 hours, something like that, 6 hours that the jury took, deliberations to reach that guilty verdict.
Which is a fairly short time for a murder case, as complicated as this one was. The prosecutors, after initially bringing in the exorcist and talking about it being a black mass and a ritual killing, they went another way, and they argued that he was a priest who worked in a hospital that was run by the nuns. It was the Mercy Hospital. Sisters of Mercy were the owners and operators of the hospital. And Father Robinson, the testimony showed that he didn't really like women. He didn't like talking to women. He didn't like being bossed around by Sister Margaret Ann. And so they changed the motive from being a ritual killing to being just a man who got angry at a woman and lashed out and stabbed her.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the motive, because obviously, I mean, the jury's looking for that. So, I mean, you've got, okay, this guy's mad at women, but then you've got, well, it may have been a satanic ritual. So, I mean, talk about some of the other key evidence in this case, because there wasn't a ton tying him to it.
Well, the murder occurred on Holy Saturday, which is one of the holiest days in the church year. So the timing was very a key part of the reasoning that there was something more than just a murder here. The way that she had been stabbed in the shape of an upside-down cross, that's an indication of an upside-down cross is a satanic version of the Christian cross. And the Paschal candle representing Jesus and Easter was in the room, and the Holy Eucharist was in the in the sacristy. It's the only day of the year when it's not in the chapel. So she was murdered in the presence of God, which, you know, Jesus is the Holy Eucharist, according to the Catholic Church.
You had written in 2006 in The Blade, casual observers were telling me they were sure there was too much reasonable doubt to convict the priest. It was a logical argument, but the crime occurred 26 years ago. People's memories fade. There were no witnesses who actually saw the murder, and there was no DNA. So were you surprised at not only the verdict, but the quick verdict?
Well, I went into the trial thinking, you know, I'm just going to see what they have. And nobody would talk to me before the trial because they didn't want to, you know, ruin their case, either pro or against the priest. So, yeah, I went in there. I thought I was pretty objective and just said, let's see what the evidence is. And by the end of the trial, I was convinced that Father Robinson did commit the murder. I think the key part of the evidence was the letter opener that had a unique shape and was found in his apartment and at the hospital. Also, his whereabouts that morning were questionable. He said he never left his apartment, which was like upstairs and down a hallway from where the chapel and the sacristy was. But, you know, they brought in 3 different people who said they saw Father Robinson in the hallway near where the murder occurred, outside the chapel doors, early that morning. And so, you know, his whereabouts, he had lied about where he was. The murder weapon was likely the letter opener, which was found in his apartment that had been scrubbed clean.
Yeah, there was a quote that it fit like a key in a lock.
Exactly. Yeah, they exhumed Sister Margaret M. Paul's body, and Dr. Diane Barnett, she was assistant county coroner, I think, at the time. She removed a section of her jawbone, her mandible, where there was a wound mark, and she took the tip of the blade in front of other detectives and put it into the mandible, the wound in the jawbone. And they said it fit like a key in a lock. It was just, and it was not, like I said, it was not a flat blade, not a usual shape. So that was pretty strong.
What's that we're looking at here? Are those, does that go on that circular part to the right there?
Yes, that's the medallion that the detectives pried off the letter opener. That letter opener is about 9 inches, and it was from a museum in Washington that the Boy Scouts had brought back and given to Robinson as a gift. And they pried they couldn't find any evidence of fingerprints or blood or anything. This was in 1980. So they popped that off the letter opener and tested it with a chemical, and it showed the presumptive evidence of the presence of blood. So that was it wasn't a very strong like DNA or anything like that, but it made the detectives think that maybe there had been blood.
You have to explain why there would be blood on a letter opener like that, yeah.
Especially,
And you had said that if he had chucked this into the Maumee, so did the police take this back in 1980, or did they take it in 2004 or whenever they reopened it?
No, they found it like a few days after the murder when they searched his apartment at the hospital, and but they, you know, without DNA, for whatever reason, whether they just didn't want to pursue a priest as a murderer suspect, they never really did much with it. But they, you know, it was locked away, and when they reopened the case in 2003, that's when they started looking at this.
But that's interesting, because they must have thought it could have possibly been a murder weapon if they actually confiscated it back in 1980, right?
Yes. In fact, Detective William Keena, when he found it in Robinson's desk, he lifted it up very carefully and said, "I think we found a murder weapon." So, you know,
but we've already talked about the fact that there were people perhaps inside the police department who were actively protecting him too. And maybe one detective says to another, hey, I don't think this is very significant, or let's go in this direction. And that may be all it takes. I want to talk about once he was arrested in 2004, he did an interview, a police interrogation. It was 90 minutes long. Did you watch that whole videotape? And that was shown at trial, right?
Yes.
And what did we glean from that interview? I mean, how did he seem, and what did he say?
Well, Father Robinson, and by the way, he died in 2014 after being in prison. He was very mild-mannered, quiet person, and you know, he didn't look like a murderer, you know, but he's being investigated, and he's kind of like dodging the questions, and he's not really lying about anything, but it wasn't a very convincing argument that he didn't do it, and so he lived actually right next door to the Toledo Police.
Scott Park.
Yeah, the Scott Park branch office there. And so they said, we're taking you in, and they walked him over to the police department and arrested him.
So that's where they interviewed him, at Scott Park? So they
Yes.
basically just walked him next door and
Yeah.
said, come on over here.
He had been interviewed several times in 1980, and he went through a couple of polygraph lie detector tests, which were inconclusive. But they said there was some implications that he was not telling the whole truth or something along those lines in the police report. And then one time he was being interrogated, this was like a week after the murder. They took him to the safety building downtown and were interrogating him, and there was a knock on the door, and it was the deputy police chief and Robinson's lawyer and Monsignor Jerome Schmidt from the Toledo Catholic Diocese were all there. And they walked in and they told Robinson to get up and you're coming with us. And they walked him out of the building, and that was basically the end of the investigation in 1980.
That's unbelievable that even those parties would be coming together, seen at the police station, and then leaving with a person of interest at that point.
Right.
You know.
Detective Art Mark said, you never, ever, ever interrupt a police interrogation. So, you know, the fact that the deputy chief was there.
Do you know, and I don't remember, I did read your book, it's been many, many years. Do you know if this created a huge dissension or a split down the middle in the police department? I would imagine that if a detective had a potential murder weapon and a suspect who was seen around, and then someone just comes in and says, hey, give me all of the evidence, the case, and then I'm going to bring in these people from the Catholic Diocese, that would create some frustration and anger inside the Toledo Police Department.
Yes, certainly. There was a lot of Toledo police that were already unhappy with the way the church was being handled. They had to like park outside the different parishes on Sunday morning and watch traffic and make sure that the offerings got to the bank and all that. And that really wasn't there. They had other things that they would rather be doing, but they were assigned to do that. And then there were the police that arrested priests for sexual abuse, and then the cases got thrown. They never got charged, and the priest got sent to another diocese, and that was the end of that. So, yeah, there was definitely a division in the police. And in fact, the first policeman at the scene was at the hospital having a cup of coffee when the announcement came over the PA for a Mr. Swift call, which means it's an emergency. So he went down, and that was Dave Davidson, I'm sorry. And he went to the sacristy and kind of took control of the scene and told people, all these doctors and nurses were in there, and he told them, the nun is dead, so we need to clear the scene. Mm-hmm. But then when the higher-ups got in there, they sent him away from the hospital to the bus stop to look for a possible suspect. He was very angry about that, and he's the one that he filed under the Freedom of Information Act for all the police reports. So Dave Davidson wrote to the Pope. He wrote to the president. Wow. He said there's this terrible cover-up of a priest that killed a nun in Toledo, and I really need you to look into this. And nobody really did anything. Wow.
So you're just talking about the division in the police department, but I'm kind of wondering what it did to the Catholic community when you've got this, well-known Catholic priest, and this was not too long after the whole Catholic abuse scandals were starting to hit. So what did this do to the Catholic community?
Yeah, I mean, in 1980 it was a whole different scenario. You know, the Catholic Church was the dominant factor in Toledo. But by 2004, when the arrest was made, yeah, they had just been reeling from the sexual abuse scandal that went across the country involving different parishes or different dioceses. And yeah, the Catholics were struggling, you know. In fact, when I did book signings, I was a little worried about some of the, you know, I thought these little Catholic ladies would come up and hit me with their umbrella or something, but most of them would say, I'm so glad you wrote this book because nobody told us what really happened. You know, now we know the whole story. So even the devout Catholics were happy to get the truth finally after all those years.
You guys actually, in your article in 2004, you did interview some nuns. I think they were the Sisters of Notre Dame, maybe, something like that. Sisters of St. Francis was. Mm-hmm. And they said they were stunned. It was awkward, is how they described it. And they were sad for the church and the sisters, but they were trying to, you said, be non-judgmental about this and see how it played out.
Right. You know, I would like to say that this is not a condemnation of the entire Catholic Church, but, you know, just a bad apple, Father Robinson, and then the efforts to protect the church. You know, I mean, they shouldn't have covered up. They should have arrested him in 1980, but that didn't happen. So, yeah, the clerics were, most of the priests that I know in the Toledo diocese were just really great priests. I mean, wonderful, holy men, and they were glad to see that this guy, Robinson, who had committed a murder and was allegedly in a satanic cult, that, you know, justice was finally served, and that helped them, I think.
So do you believe all these years later that this was a just ritualistic ceremony killing that one person did, or do you think that, and maybe it's not an either or question, but do you think that Father Robinson was involved in some sort of coven where there were other priests involved in some sort of satanical world?
I mean, you know, this is really, it sounds like the Twilight Zone or something when you start talking about that, but I believe that there was a cult in Toledo that included some priests, including Chet Warren, who was, you know, the oblate of St. Francis, because I've talked to other people who said they were victims. Not all of them, you know, ended up going to court or whatever, but they told me that they were abused by Chet Warren, and some of them mentioned Father Robinson, and, you know, one woman said she was, as a little girl, she was put inside a casket and covered with cockroaches as part of a ceremony, plus she was sexually abused. And, you know, I've heard too many stories from people and they're not related people, they're just, you know, different victims telling me these kinds of things, especially once the book came out and the trial went on, then people were coming forward, stepping forward. They were afraid. Nobody would ever believe them, you know, but at that point.
I mean, it's hard for us. I mean, it's hard for me to believe it, you know,
Even
now, 20 years later. I mean, that's crazy to think about that. But, you know, Father Robinson, until he died, I mean, he never admitted to this, did he? I mean, I think, were there other suspects? Is there any chance that he could have been innocent?
Well, you know, he never professed his innocence until after the trial. And then he issued a statement saying that I didn't kill Sister Margaret Ann Paul. And I like what Dean Mandros, the prosecutor, who's now a judge, I said, what do you say about Robinson's profession that he's innocent? And he goes, too little, too late. You know, he should have said that during the trial. But after that, he was, you know, he had already been convicted. There were other theories. I mean, that Coral Eugene Watts was a mass murderer who was in Detroit and conceivably could have come down to Toledo and murdered the nun, but.
Well, we have a story on that. Let's run that.
With Father Gerald Robinson now serving 5 years in prison, his defense team has a new question it wants to ask a new jury. Was it serial killer Coral Eugene Watts who killed Sister Margaret Ann Paul in a hospital chapel in 1980 and not the priest?
I think it's interesting that the reason that the defense counsel didn't delve into the theory was in part they thought he was in jail, which he was not.
Robinson's attorney Richard Kruger says 179 pages of police reports found after Robinson's trial indicate 6 witnesses at the hospital described another man who left the scene. He says Watts lived in Ann Arbor, and one officer there believes Watts was in Toledo when Sister Paul was killed.
Would it have helped you in that decision to know that not just 2, but 8 witnesses saw an unidentified black male at the scene of the crime on the day it happened?
Would it have helped
Right.
me? It would have helped if they saw Mr. Watts.
What they're attempting to do is create a defense out of essentially non-existent, non-relevant evidence.
Prosecutor John Weglian says Robinson's initial defense team knew of Watts before the trial. They testified they did not mention him due to a lack of similarities with his crimes and Paul's murder, since it was proven Paul was killed using Robinson's letter opener.
Was there ever a reference made to a weapon like this being used?
No.
Watts was also asked by other investigators if he committed any crimes in Toledo. The killer said no. That was all before he died in 2007. Weglian believes this is all the defense's way to put Robinson on the stand in front of a new jury. Lisa Rontla, WTOL 11.
So tell us more about him and why he was brought up.
Robinson?
The alternative suspect.
Carl,
Yeah.
Well, the defense was looking for some other possible suspect in order to have some reasonable doubt that Father Robinson, maybe he didn't do it. And so he was he had been in Detroit and had access, he could have driven to Toledo, killed a nun, gone back to Detroit. But he was in prison in Texas, and they asked the Toledo police asked the Texas police to question him about the Toledo case of Sister Margaret Ann. And Watts said he never had stepped foot in Toledo. And, he was already a convicted serial killer, so it wouldn't have cost him anything if he had admitted it.
Not only that, but to go to a hospital in a chapel, that's not really an obvious choice when you're thinking of if you want to kill somebody, let alone a nun. My first thought wouldn't be go to the Mercy Hospital chapel.
Right.
Yeah, and you also, serial killers, their typical victim is not like a 70-plus-year-old nun. That's not typical. But Dave, before we get out of here, I actually want to talk about the book a little bit. And I know you had said you have boxes of documents like after this case. So talk about, why you decided to write the book and your process for writing it.
Well, it's an interesting way things developed is the priest was arrested on Friday, and the police reporters covered the story. And then on Saturday, I went down to the safety building and talked to Steve Forrester and Tom Ross about the case. And they're the ones that they openly said they believed it was a ritual murder. So I wrote a story that day for the Sunday paper, and top of page 1, they had something about, police believe it was a ritual murder. And so Monday I went to work and I started getting calls from New York publishers saying, we saw that story and we think you should write a book about it. And I was like, I had never thought about writing a book on it, but I started putting all the pieces together and I said, well, it is a pretty fascinating case. And I know it better than anybody, so instead of somebody coming in from LA or New York and writing the book, I might as well do it myself.
And there it is, and we were talking about this before, but there's a picture of Father Robinson. He's actually doing the funeral mass at that. That's what that picture is, right?
Exactly, yeah. That's why Continuum was the publishers. They really loved that photo, and because in the foreground you can see the casket is covered with the pall cloth, and Robinson is under the crucifix saying the funeral mass for Sister Margaret and Paul in Fremont. So Yeah,
Wow.
it's kind of a powerful image, but you have to have it explained to you. I later did a new cover of the book that is more visual than that one.
Yeah, let's see it. Hold it up for the camera. This is the new cover.
Oops.
And where can people get the book, Dave?
It's available on Amazon, and it's available as an ebook and as a paperback. And I added some more, another couple chapters to the end because when the first book came out in 2006, Robinson was still alive. And so I wrote about the circumstances of his death and got a few more comments from relatives of the nun and things like that. So the new paperback and ebook has a little more extra than the original.
So does that mean I could get it on Audible? Because I just got an Audible account.
Yes.
So I could listen to it on Audible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I remember hearing about this when I first moved to Toledo and reading the book, and it was very, very fascinating. You did a great job with it. I'm sure that's a lot of work to pull all that stuff together.
Well, the interesting thing is I had a contract to get the book turned in. They wanted to publish in October of 2006, and the priest's trial was originally scheduled for like late 2005, and it kept getting pushed back, and finally took place in April and May of 2006. And I didn't know this, but I didn't have to keep that contract deadline for the publisher. I'm a news guy. I always meet deadlines. Everybody said, nobody writes a book that fast. But, you know, I worked all I could, you know, reading all of
Yeah, I read how your wife helped you out with the kids while you were still working at the Blade. We talk all the time about how we would love to do more true crime stuff on the side. But, man, it's an exhausting job being a journalist to begin with and then going and writing a big book on the side.
And I think when you started that book, I mean, the thing is, this is a book, but you don't have an ending because we don't know what's going to happen. But then
that's right.
You got the ending.
The trial had not taken place yet when I signed the contract. So if he was exonerated, it probably would have been, you know, not as good a story. But the fact that he was found guilty and sent to prison for life, you know, that was the right ending, I guess.
So I just think this would just make a fascinating movie. and I think people had actually reached out to you about that, right? I mean,
yes, I've had a number of Hollywood producers and documentarians talk about, you know, doing a book, doing a movie. It's funny because they're so excited, and they, you know, they call me every day. Then they start calling less frequently, and then I don't hear from them. And then a few months later, somebody else calls. I mean, putting a movie together is a, you know, multi-million-dollar project, and there's a lot of pieces involved in that. So I mean, I think one of these days it will be a movie. I mean, it's got a murder of a nun by a priest.
It's got everything,
You know, cold case investigation, a cover-up in
Rituals.
the church. Yeah, there's all these ingredients would make for a good movie.
Documentary at the very least, someday on Netflix. I know we realize that next year is the 20th anniversary of the trial, and we would love to continue to do a deeper dive into this because there's so many interesting aspects. Dave, thank you so much for your time, for joining us on Case Files. The book's excellent. Congratulations on all your success there.
And it's great seeing you again. Like I said, we worked together from 1998 to 2012, 13, something like that.
It's
so
great
thanks
to be
for coming
here.
in.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.
Thanks for joining us for this week's 11 Investigates Case Files. We'll see you back here next time.